Souls games that so clearly inspired it.
Dark Souls.
Much like Dark Souls.
Soulslike.
Dark Soulish.
Like Dark Souls.
Dark Souls.
Soulslike.
It's like Dark Souls. It's got Souls influence. Is this the Dark Souls of From Software games? It's a Souls-like. What the hell is a Souls-like? Seriously, I don't know. Listen, I love From Software games as much as the next guy. Well, actually, probably more. These are the games that cemented From Software as my favorite game studio, and yet I don't fully understand what makes something a Souls-like. That's why I'm making this video. This isn't a super in-depth analysis with groundbreaking information that no one other than me has even begun to fathom because of my vast, irrefutable intellect that you're just jealous of. Compare your life to mine and kiss yourself. This is meant to be a way for me to organize my thoughts on the matter and spend way too much time editing the video only to be told that I'm stupid and my argument is invalid by some sigma in the comments. The games From Software makes are incredible for the most part, so it only makes sense that everyone would try to draw inspiration from them. But these titles that claim to be like the FromSoft Souls games seem to not really understand the value that the mainline Souls games bring to the table. These developers appear to be transfixed on purely the aesthetic of the real Souls games and are blind to anything more depthful. Well, I say this, but as I mentioned before, I also don't really get it either. So let's start looking into it. As far as I'm aware, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring are video games. So let's focus on the gameplay and the mechanics first. Many developers seem to think Dark Souls is Dark Souls because it is a stupid hard third-person action RPG with checkpoints, an annoyingly cryptic world, and an iframe-endowed dodge with a sprint function mapped to the same button. That's it! You cracked the code. You have figured out Dark Souls. That's all it was. Congratulations, you are now Hidetaka Miyazaki, the creator of video games. If this is what Dark Souls' identity was, then most games would be like Dark Souls. Now that I think about it, that would probably explain why everything is a Souls-like these days. These Souls-likes don't feel like Souls games, which is why I put the quotation marks around it. This part of the script is pointless, I should delete it. But they look similar to Dark Souls in the movement, combat, and exploration. So wouldn't that make it like Dark Souls, aka a Souls-like? Maybe. But the biggest problem is that these games don't feel like Dark Souls. They feel soulless, no pun intended. They feel hollow, pun intended. These games are not like Dark Souls, they're copies. The developers focus too much on trying to make a game similar to Dark Souls without deriving any inspiration from it. They only look at the superficial aspects of the game like button mapping, picking shit up after death, and God forbid the difficulty. These are Souls clones. They are not like Dark Souls, they are pathetic attempts at replicating it. Alright, genius. How do you get that soul and jam it into the game to make it a Souls-like? That's a good question, and I'm not 100% sure. But here's what I think. The game needs a solid identity before the Souls elements are added. This would explain why the appropriately named Mortal Shell feels like an empty, vague, forgettable mess that doesn't provide anything unique, but it doesn't explain why a game like The Surge still sucks. The Surge has the very unique and interesting mechanic of dismembering enemies in order to collect their gear. But this game falls flat in arguably the most important parts, the boss fights. The dismemberment mechanic isn't used at all in these battles, as far as I've seen. I haven't beat the game because I hate it. But it's the main part of the game's identity, and it's underutilized. So maybe it feels like a clone because the identity wasn't fully realized before deciding to start copying Dark Souls. There's one game that I'm on the fence about when considering it a Souls-like or clone, and that is Code Vein. This game has some really interesting and cool ideas, like the fact that your stats are tied to your equipment and your class rather than individually leveling them each time you increase level. And your classes can be switched on the fly, which means you can essentially respec your skills and alter your build in an instant. The game allows you to assign 8 special abilities that you can customize however you want. There are light Souls elements like the classic leveling up at bonfires, iframe dodges mapped to the east button, weapon scaling, and the like, but when the character creator is the best part of the game and there are so many gravity-defying anime titty everywhere, it's hard to see it as a Souls game. Clearly this game has its own pretty well realized identity. So why does it still feel like a cheap imitation of a Souls game? The world and level design. This is a huge part of the soul in FromSoft Souls games. Hey, do you remember that part in Dark Souls 1 where the bridge to the main Anor Londo Cathedral is out, so you have to use a flying buttress from a different building as a path to get across? And when you make that realization, it is really exciting and satisfying because you're utilizing the architecture in an unconventional but clever way? Well, Code Vein tries this and fails a lot. Code Vein has a sorry excuse for an Anor Londo clone that attempts to copy that idea, what feels like hundreds of times, and none of it is clever or satisfying, because the architecture and general level design don't make sense. The level design in Code Vein is absolute garbage. It is some of the most confusing, illogical House of Leaves bullshit I've seen in a game like this. It is nearly impossible to navigate at some points. And there's a fucking map. It truly is baffling. Also, there's copy and pasted enemies everywhere, Scholar of the First Sin style. Miyazaki has a knack for making some very unique, memorable, and deep game worlds. Everything seems to have a reason logically and lore-wise. When you enter an area in Dark Souls, you can usually see places of interest in the distance so you can set a goal for where you should go next. The levels themselves may have some strange paths, but overall make sense once you start to navigate through them. Most areas in Souls clones, like Code Vein and Dark Souls 2, have you explore environments where you're in a maze of tight hallways, or you're trying to navigate paths and architecture that don't make a lick of sense. This causes exploration and navigation to become a chore of trial and error, rather than an exciting adventure. It's a witless excuse for time padding. Another thing that's done extremely well in Miyazaki's games is how these areas connect and feel connected. If we look at everyone's favorite area, Blighttown, as an example, one side of the swamp has a giant nest made of web. It is one of the most notable things in the area. Inside this giant nest is a big spider. This spider has fire attacks and vomits lava. The area immediately following this big spider battle is a zone filled with lava. Going from a swamp to a spider nest to demonic ruins may seem like a huge leap, but these little environmental touches help the connections between these areas make sense. And to go even further, NPCs that teach fire magic and creatures that breathe fire reside in the swamp outside the nest, strengthening the connection to these fiery ruins. Even with all the unique areas in these games, none of them feel disconnected. Maybe Undead Asylum in Dark Souls 1, but it's a tutorial zone, so ease up a little. The smooth environmental shifts and thematic enemies certainly make the zone-to-zone transitions feel natural and cohesive, but the greatest glue of them all is the lore. If you have talked with someone about a Souls game, or have heard of VaatiVidya, then you know that these games are dripping with story. At first glance, the games seem to be purely gameplay with little to no rhyme or reason as to why you want to murder everything, and that's part of the beauty. These games put gameplay before anything else, no matter how depthful and interesting the lore is. And that lore is interesting. I talked of how physically connected areas truly feel connected, but the lore is what helps bind these regions that may not be directly adjacent to the rest of the world. The stories of these games are very easily overlooked because they're presented in a vague, enigmatic way. However, they are incredibly well thought out and concrete. These games' stories are so solid and expansive that every little detail seems to matter. There could be something as grandiose as an epic battle between two demigods that leaves the land plagued with disease and causes horrible mutations to the wildlife, giving the region a very unique look with some pretty freaky looking creatures. Or something as simple as this person made this spell. But both can be just as important in the overall story. Most of the information is derived from environmental storytelling and the descriptions of items you find. But it is also so much more than you may think. There is thought put into every little thing. Like the intricate design on the armor set of an enemy that moves too fast for you to ever analyze it. Or faces that appear on the backs of crabs in this one specific small pond. There's a creator on YouTube that goes by Zullie the Witch, whose entire shtick is finding these minute details in the environment and character models of these games. And the things she finds blow me away. Not only because she finds such tiny intricate details, but also that they're even there in the first place. It truly feels as if everything has a reason, that there is meaning to everything, This is key in making a game feel like Dark Souls. The world gives a sense of history, like it has been lived in. 99.9% of the story has already been told, and you are the event that caps it off. This is so important in making a proper Souls game, but this type of world is only achievable through meticulous design, and that is why so many people fail to replicate it. So many developers that try to emulate the enigmatic storytelling of Dark Souls think the vaguer the better, and they are so wrong. The item descriptions in Dark Souls aren't just vague mumbo-jumbo gobbledygook. They provide key information like events, characters, and locations. You know, actual information. This information can then be used to start piecing together bigger ideas like motivations, politics, and maybe even conclusions to these stories. You are given notably unique puzzle pieces, which help you understand where they go in the bigger picture. I can only think of one game outside of From Software's work that pulled off this type of storytelling, and that game is Blasphemous. In fact, Blasphemous is the most Souls-like non-Souls game I've ever played. This is a game I would truly consider a Souls-like, and it's a Metroid-inspired 2D action platformer. It hardly has any Souls mechanics, and yet it gives off more of a Dark Souls vibe than something like Mortal Shell. I never knew why, but now that I've been talking through all these points, I think I get it. It has its own strong identity. The world and level design is interesting while still making sense, and maybe most importantly, it gets the storytelling right. The most interesting thing about the story of Blasphemous is that it's far simpler than it appears, and yet it still remains enigmatic in nature. I believe it's because the game is so fucking weird. The story elements in Blasphemous are presented in a fairly straightforward way. Sometimes people will even tell you exactly what you need to do and why. And yet, the game still feels like it's hiding things from you. There is environmental storytelling, as well as item descriptions similar to Dark Souls, but they go a step further and provide a full page of lore for every item. Everything seems to have a reason, like Dark Souls. And this makes the world feel alive. Play Blasphemous, it's the best Souls-like. So I guess that's it. A Souls-like is a game that borrows elements from Souls games without sacrificing its own identity. It crafts a beautifully intricate world that has reason behind its structure and provides a rich, possibly enigmatic story for the world that is not mandatory for the game completion but is presented through gameplay. That's what I think makes a Souls-like. A Souls clone would be something that fails an attempt at meeting one of these points. So something like Hollow Knight wouldn't be considered either because it has one or two small mechanics that may be inspired by Dark Souls, but it doesn't try to flat out copy it. Again, this is essentially me brainstorming what I believe makes a game like Dark Souls. You are welcome to believe what you want, whether it's a shit take or not. I just want to know why I hate most Souls-likes, and I think I mostly figured it out. If you think I missed something, let me know in the comments. I'm just so fucking sick of these publishers trying to ride the coattails of From Software's success and doing so in such a lazy, uninspired way. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention difficulty. That's because it's a non-factor. If you think Dark Souls is good because it's hard, you shouldn't be designing video games. Peace.